Hello, thank you for joining me for my presentation on the inclusion of Kaaps in the Woordeboek van Afrikaanse Taal. As a comprehensive descriptive dictionary, the Woordeboek van Afrikaanse Taal, or WhAT as it is also known, concerns itself since its inception in 1926 with recording Afrikaans language in its widest sense. This means that both spoken and written material from all Afrikaans varieties are included in the dictionary. According to its fifth editor-in-chief, Dr. Dirk van Schalkwyk, the Bureau of the WhAT also took special care over the years to collect as many as possible examples of regional varieties for its database in order to give a more comprehensive and representative coverage to these varieties in the dictionary. Since its inception, the WhAT has thus been ideally positioned to reflect the equal status of all the varieties of Afrikaans. Nevertheless, the WhAT has endured some scrutiny over the years with regard to the inclusion or apparent lack of inclusion of especially Cape Afrikaans, also known as Kaaps. The WhAT has in fact been accused as recently as 2019, after the publication of its 15th volume, of showing great gaps with regard to the language use of a more inclusive language community, and that the sources used in the volume of the WhAT show a total lack of especially coloured female voices. This critique echoes renewed calls over the past few years for the recognition and inclusion of Kaaps as part of the wider Afrikaans speech community. These calls arose from Afrikaans' decades-long association with Afrikaner nationalism. As Afrikaans increasingly became a symbol of the Afrikaner struggle for recognition as a nation at the beginning of the 19th century, the ideology of Afrikaner nationalism that was ultimately a racist nationalist movement was tightly interwoven with an Afrikaans language movement that sought to appropriate Afrikaans as the language of the Afrikaner. Instead of focusing on the diverse range of varieties within the Afrikaans language, many linguists participated in what Cornelius calls the Afrikaner nationalist whitewashing of Afrikaans. Although about 50% of the native Afrikaans-speaking population consists of non-white speakers, the language varieties of the white speakers of Afrikaans were overemphasized, while the language varieties, mostly spoken by colored speakers of Afrikaans, were stigmatized. One way in which this was done was by compiling dictionaries from an exclusively white perspective, according to Webb and Creel. This entailed that dictionaries often did not reflect the varietal diversity of Afrikaans, but focused mainly on standard Afrikaans, a variety which has as its basis Eastern Cape Afrikaans, Eastern Afrikaans, which was mostly spoken by the white speakers of Afrikaans. Since the 1980s, however, there has been increasing consensus among linguists that Afrikaans is more than just its standard variety. Standard Afrikaans is but one of the many varieties of Afrikaans that all enjoy equal status. It is against this background that the question arises whether the WhAT also gives a sense of Afrikaner nationalist whitewashing, as it is called by Cornelius. To what extent does the WhAT reflect the equal status of the other varieties of Afrikaans in relation to the standard Afrikaans through its inclusion of Kaaps up into volume 15 of the dictionary? Before this question can be answered, however, it is necessary to explicate the term Kaaps. As pointed out by Hendricks, this variety of Afrikaans has been known by many names over the years. Similarly, Kaaps, which is the term currently used generally and in academic circles for this language form, the definition of this term has been hotly debated in and outside of academic circles over the years. As I cannot go into detail on the matter within the constraints of this presentation, the following comprehensive definition by Hendricks should suffice. From a variational linguistic perspective, Kaaps is regarded as a variety of the dialect bundle Southwestern Afrikaans, which as a form of colloquial Afrikaans dates back to the 17th century influence of slaves on the formation of Afrikaans, which currently manifests mainly as a sociolect associated with the working class of the Cape Peninsula, and which in terms of its dominant speaker corps can be typified as a colour variety of Afrikaans. Considering this definition, I would like to point to a few characteristics of Kaaps which should be kept in mind when evaluating the WhAT. Firstly, it is a variety of Afrikaans, specifically a sub-variety of Southwestern Afrikaans. This suggests that Kaaps should indeed form part of a comprehensive dictionary of Afrikaans, as is the case with the WhAT. Moving closer geographically, Kaaps is, according to Hendricks, chiefly limited to the Cape Peninsula, which means that Kaaps also includes the Afrikaans of the Cape Muslims, known as Cape Muslim Afrikaans. When examining the inclusion of Kaaps in the WhAT, lexical items from Cape Muslim Afrikaans should therefore also be considered. A further aspect of Kaaps expressed by Hendrik's definition is the mainly colloquial or spoken nature of Kaaps. As a dictionary which claims to include both written and spoken material, WhAT should therefore endeavour to include Kaaps even if there exists very limited material in this variety. Turning now to my previous question with regard to the inclusion of Kaaps in volume 1 to 15 of the WhAT. The quick answer to this question is that it is a very difficult question to answer accurately. The primary obstacle in answering this question relates to the age of the WhAT. At 95 years of age, the WhAT has been written over many decades by many different lexicographers. This resulted in a somewhat fragmented dictionary characterized by inconsistencies between the various volumes. The random application of the lexicographic style guide in the first 6 volumes of the WhAT was only remedied in 1989 when the WhAT involved 9 linguists and meta-lexicographers in a process to radically revise the WhAT style guide in order to produce a dictionary that could reflect the state of the linguistic and meta-lexicographic research of the time. This revised style guide was implemented from volume 9 onwards and resulted in more uniform subsequent editions. However, the inconsistencies in the first 8 volumes makes it very difficult for any researcher to perform a reliable search in these volumes. As no uniform approach was followed in the labeling of Kaaps in the first 8 volumes of the WhAT, it is very difficult to determine with any amount of certainty the extent to which Kaaps was included in these volumes. As an example of this inconsistency, consider the following Kaaps examples from the WhAT and note especially the difference in labels or lack thereof being used. The group of Kaaps lexical items that are somewhat easier to trace in volumes 1 to 8 of the WhAT is the Cape Muslim Afrikaans forms. This is to a great extent thanks to the etymology provided as part of these entries. Etymological information relevant to Cape Muslim Afrikaans include lemmas of Arabic, Malay, Javanese, and Indonesian origin and produce the following results. Although this method yielded more results than the random method of selection followed in searching for other Kaaps lexical items, it nevertheless produced a very small sample when considering the volume 1 to 8 of the WhAT contains about 146,000 lemmas. Does this then mean that the WhAT indeed shows signs of Cornelis's Afrikaner nationalist whitewashing? I do not believe so. Although it is difficult to draw scientifically sound conclusions with regard to the amount of Kaaps included in the WhAT, there does seem to be a lack of representation with regard to the inclusion of Kaaps in the WhAT. However, if it was the result of a deliberate attempt to conceal the fact that Kaaps is part of the Afrikaans language, there wouldn't have been, in my opinion, any traces of Kaaps and Cape Muslim Afrikaans in the WhAT. The lack of representation rather stems, in my view, from a lack of research about Kaaps, as well as a lack of printed material in Kaaps. Given the linguistic environment in which the first 8 volumes of the WhAT were compiled, that is, an environment in which the language varieties of white speakers of Afrikaans were overemphasized, it stands to reason that more resources were channeled towards the research of and publication in these varieties, while very little was done for Kaaps. As lexicographers often do not have the time to do linguistic fieldwork themselves, they are at the mercy of the research and other material available in a specific variety. This was also the case with the WhAT. Through its card system whereby speakers of Afrikaans could send in examples of Afrikaans language used to the WhAT, lexicographers at the WhAT were often dependent on what they received from the speakers. Given the negative view of Kaaps propagated during those years, it should not be surprising that speakers of Afrikaans did not send in a lot of Kaaps material. Similarly, there wasn't a lot of text published in Kaaps that the WhAT lexicographers could draw on. But what about volumes 9 to 15 of the WhAT? Do they show any more signs of Kaaps inclusion? Although the introduction of the new meta-lexicographically and linguistically based style guide of the WhAT led to a greater degree of consistency in the dictionary, it is once again not that easy to identify Kaaps in these volumes. WhAT does not make distinction with regard to the different regional varieties of Afrikaans, but views all words, senses, and expressions included in the WhAT as Afrikaans in its own right. Quoting Braun, Kaaps, however, points out that lexicographic labels should also mark the regional spread of lemmas. He goes on to say that a comprehensive dictionary should include a big collection of varietal material which should be expertly labeled by means of geographic and or regional labels. And that these labels should be supported by other microstructural elements in the same article, for example, by giving an indication where a certain lemma, sense, or expression was recorded. As Hartman, however, points out, it is in practice impossible to label a particular expression as belonging to a certain dialect, without at the same time taking into account dialectal, stylistic, and register features. One inherent limitation is the availability of linguistic information. Many regional dialects have never been surveyed and analyzed. For those languages and areas where dialect atlases have been compiled, data are often incomplete and out of date. It is not surprising, therefore, that authors of dictionaries are often left to their own makeshift devices and reductionistic categorizations. According to Gauss, the satisfactory labeling of an entry as belonging to a specific regional variety is only possible if the lexicographer is well versed in dialectological research and if the lexicographer assumes the role of field worker, carefully and with the necessary expertise record their dialectal phenomena. As mentioned earlier, the lexicographer seldom has the time to undertake this dialectal work themselves. Given the difficulty of making exact demarcations across the entire geographical spectrum, geographical or regional labeling in dictionaries is often a headache for lexicographers, according to Norrie. That is why, as Bayer points out, application of geographical or regional labels in dictionaries seem to be a universal problem. Another problem with regard to the labeling of Kaaps entries in the WhAT stems from the nature of this variety itself. It's clearly seen from Hendricks' earlier definition of Kaaps, and as Carstens points out, it's difficult to exactly define Kaaps, but it is mainly limited geographically to the Cape environment, as a geolect, but it also shows characteristics of social stratification, as a sociolect. This almost dual character of Kaaps makes it difficult to accurately label. Furthermore, it has become increasingly difficult to accurately demarcate Kaaps, as some Kaaps entries have started to acquire wider use, that is, use outside of the Cape Peninsula, and some has even started to cross over into general Afrikaans language use. For this reason, and as a colloquial variety of Afrikaans, Kaaps entries are labeled in the WhAT as geselstaal. Kaaps is, however, just one of many colloquial varieties of Afrikaans. An electronic search in volumes 9 to 15 of the WhAT, according to the label geselstaal, yielded 1,810 results, of which only a few examples are given here. In volumes 9 to 15, Cape Muslim Afrikaans entries are either labeled as in die taal van Muslims or in die taal van die Muslims. An electronic search according to these labels yielded only 13 results, while yet more labels in die taal van die Kaapse Muslims, in die taal van die Kaapse Maleiers, in die geselstaal van Muslims and Islam yielded only 4, 1, 2, and 1 more result respectively. Some Cape Afrikaans entries, however, are not labeled at all. Although one would expect that a great deal of consistency in volumes 9 to 15 would also apply to lexicographic labels, this doesn't seem to be the case with Cape Muslim Afrikaans entries. These factors again make it very difficult for a researcher to determine the presence of Kaaps entries in the WhAT. Nevertheless, although I could not accurately determine the amount of Kaaps entries included in the WhAT up into volume 15, there does seem to be a somewhat of a gap with regard to representation of these items. This led to a decision being taken in July of 2020 by the current director and editor-in-chief of the WhAT, Dr. Willem Botha, to launch a deliberate effort to include more Kaaps in the WhAT. As I've done some prior research on Kaaps, Dr. Botha delegated this task to me. The first step in the process was to actively expand the WhAT's lemma list with Kaaps lexical items. Although the WhAT's electronic lemma list already included Kaaps lemmas, thanks to lemmas excerpted from Kaaps text owned and collected by the WhAT, as well as from a personal lemma list compiled by me from various online and other Kaaps resources like the Son newspaper, the aim was to expand this lemma list even further by exerting various printed and online Kaaps resources. Apart from re-excerpting various books already owned by the WhAT, a list of recently published Kaaps texts was also identified and was subsequently acquired and excerpted. Online and printed Kaaps lemma list compiled by other researchers or the general public were also included, as well as personal emails received by the WhAT with word lists from the Son op Sondag and kakduidelik.co.za. Unpublished text like the script of the Afrikaans stage production was also included. The new Kaaps lemma list includes more than 1,500 Kaaps lexical items, including Cape Muslim Afrikaans from A to Z. Note that this list does not include lexical items already included in the WhAT, except where it was deemed necessary to revise or expand an entry. With regard to the inclusion criteria, the current criteria as it pertains to all other entries in the WhAT was maintained. At least a lemma, sense, or expression must appear in at least 5 different sources. These sources can be either printed, online, or spoken. These lexical items include unique Kaaps words, senses, and expressions, English loanwords or expressions that have been integrated into the Afrikaans pronunciation, orthography, and or morphology, as well as English loanwords that developed a unique Afrikaans meaning, where there still exists a degree of variation with regard to spelling, all possible variations were included, subject again to the minimum requirement of appearing in at least 5 sources. In each case, however, the definition or paraphrase of meaning were given at the most frequent form as deduced from the Kaaps sources. In accordance with the criteria for the inclusion of other lexical items in the WhAT, we decided to not include pronunciation phenomena like sound deletion, contractions, etc., as these are not unique to Kaaps and also isn't a matter of orthography. Exceptions were, however, made in cases where a reasonable amount of lexicalization has occurred. For this, I lean strongly on Hendricks' chapter on the nature of Kaaps in the publication Kaaps in Focus. As I am not a native speaker of Kaaps myself, the Kaaps entries are put before a panel of at least 5 experts and or speakers of Kaaps or Cape Muslim Afrikaans who evaluate the entries with regard to especially the accuracy of the definitions. Only after these experts gave the green light, the entries be published. With regard to the comment and form, special care is taken to provide information regarding the pronunciation of Kaaps words, as the pronunciation of these words often deviate from the expected standard Afrikaans pronunciation. Similarly, with regard to the commented semantics, etymological data is provided for especially lemmas, senses, or expressions of Cape Malay Afrikaans, as these items often deviate from the expected standard Afrikaans spelling. As Gous and Prinsloo point out, supporting examples play an important role in monolingual dictionaries, and they have to be selected in such a way that they complement the meaning of the paraphrase. This can only be achieved in a consistent way if a representative lexicographic corpus is used. Apart from the sources used in compiling the Kaaps lemma list, usage examples are extracted from an even larger range of texts, including online publications like Son and Kuier, especially Son's Antimona, or the Sonny and CP Worlds columns, websites and blogs like brainout.com and gevaarlik.com, as well as other online Kaaps publications. The last issue is the matter of marking Kaaps in the WhAT by means of lexicographic labels. As previously pointed out in this presentation, Kaaps presents a unique challenge when it comes to labeling. At the moment, I'm continuing with the current practice of labeling Kaaps entries as geselstaal. This issue was also put to 3 prominent sociolinguists and experts on Kaaps. Professor Frank Hendricks is of the opinion that the geselstaal label is satisfactory given the problem set out above. By labeling Kaaps as geselstaal, WhAT explicitly makes it a fully fledged part of Afrikaans, according to Hendricks. Professor Quentin Williams, on the other hand, is of the opinion that the label geselstaal diminishes the contributions of a growing number of authors who publish in Kaaps, that Kaaps should no longer be seen as a purely colloquial variety. Dr. Marceline Odendaal similarly feels that Kaaps is moving out of the purely colloquial sphere and therefore finds the label geselstaal problematic. She also points to the fact that Kaaps is increasingly being used in a wider geographical and social context and would therefore prefer that these entries not be labeled at all. From these varied reactions, it is clear that this matter needs to be researched more in detail in future in order to guarantee that WhAT continues to be a dictionary aimed at the needs of its users. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I look forward to your feedback.